Thanks for coming tonight. Sorry. Hey, come on, do the thing. There we go. As I've already told you, I'm Ann Cahalan. I'm a developer here at Detroit Labs and a survivor of Lab's first apprenticeship program. My remote is not working. So this past summer, I was assigned to a project using Swift. So I had to learn pretty quickly on the job. It was actually pretty fun and cool to use. I went to a web development boot camp and learned Ruby and Ruby on Rails, and then I came to the apprenticeship here at Labs and went from programming in Ruby to learning Objective-C, which I like to describe as going from hugging puppies to getting punched in the face. Swift, when I started out with it this summer, felt a lot more friendly and usable. And as I got better at it and found a few things I particularly liked, Elise over there strong-armed me into writing an article about one thing I particularly liked. There we go. So I wrote about how I have a little bit of a crush on guard statements. We'll be talking about them later, but basically they reminded me a little bit of a romantic hero charging in to save the day. And it started to occur to me that a lot of my experiences learning Swift were starting to feel like dealing with various romantic heroes, particularly those of probably my favorite author in the world, Jane Austen. So if you've interacted with popular culture at all in any way, ever, you're familiar with the work of Jane Austen. Her plots have been recycled into just about every sitcom and romantic comedy that's ever happened. That's fair. She recycled most of her stuff from Shakespeare, who recycled most of his stuff from Italian Commedia dell'arte, who recycled their stuff from the Greeks, who recycled it from, some people who didn't write some stuff down. That's all fine. There's only one story anyway, right? So basically, if you're not familiar, Jane Austen wrote 6 novels between 1787 and 1811. They are some of the most widely read in English literature. And she wrote mainly about the lives of women and as they were navigating the sort of expectations and social constraints of that particular time. This is a little less true than it was historically, but she did get dismissed a lot as having written sort of silly romantic novels. And they all end with the heroine marrying her beloved and everybody living happily ever after who is supposed to. But if you actually read them closely, they involve a lot more social insight and cutting commentary and criticism than they're given credit for. But we're not here, unfortunately, to talk about feminism in Jane Austen. If you ever want to do that, call me, because I can do that all day. We're here to talk about Swift and Jane Austen. So let's start with Jane Austen's maybe most famous work, Pride and Prejudice, and Swift's maybe most famous design pattern, Delegates and Protocols. So I promised you all that you wouldn't have to do any homework before you came tonight, so I will give you the Cliff Notes version of all of the plots that we're going to talk about. So at the start of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, by the way, more people should name their kids Fitzwilliam, arrives at Netherfield Hall, makes a terrible impression on everybody, particularly on Elizabeth Bennet. Shortly thereafter, an Armony officer shows up, makes a much better impression. There's a series of events, and so Jane Austen's plots are these very tightly constructed clockwork little things with lots of moving parts that all snap together at exactly the right moment, kind of like programming. I am going to buffalo through all of that so that we're not here for 6 hours. So series of events. Darcy starts to fall for Lizzie a little bit. She's starting to fall for Wickham a little bit. Darcy comes running to her side to tell her that even though her family's appalling, and he tried really hard not to because she's awful and embarrassing, he has fallen hopelessly in love with her and they should get married. Pro tip. If you are ever in a position where you're trying to swear your undying love to and propose marriage to someone, maybe don't lead with how hard you tried not to, and how you wish this wasn't going to happen, but clearly it is, so I will accept your awful family and everything that's terrible about you. That didn't quite work out for Darcy at the beginning. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Mr. Wickham has run off with Lizzie's younger sister without marrying her. This was in the late 1700s where you couldn't just find a guy and run off for a dirty weekend in Bath. That was a terrible thing to do. It was going to ruin the entire family. Everybody panics. Their dad tries to go find her. They can't. All of a sudden, everything resolves itself kind of out of nowhere because someone has, in return for making an honest woman out of the younger sister, Wickham's going to get a certain income for life. Turns out it's Darcy that paid for it. He didn't want the family to know, but eventually it comes out. They go for a walk in a garden and he proposes, and this time he does a better job of it. This kind of glosses over a lot. Some of my favorite characters and an entire subplot about Darcy's drippy friend courting Lizzie's older sister. The important part, the part that you've seen probably over and over again, is that two people meet, kind of hate each other, and then slowly fall in love. You've seen that story before. And obviously you can see the relationship this has to protocols and delegates, right? This is from the Swift documentation on protocols and delegates. In case you read things in English, that basically says that a protocol and a delegate is a contract or a blueprint for certain kinds of behavior. Each delegate has a set of default behaviors or protocols, variable declarations that you can require your subscribing class to conform to. It's up to each delegate, though, to actually build the house for this blueprint that you're giving. So, for example, let's say you've got two classes here. You've got your upstanding gentlemen and your scoundrels. Each of these classes is going to need to pitch some woo at somebody, but they're going to be pitching very different kinds of woo. So you can set up a wooing delegate, and you can say, you can create a contract. We expect that everything subscribing to the wooing delegate is going to have some endearments, and it will enact some kind of proposal. And you'll note that the details can be slightly different. These conform both to the wooing delegate, even though in one case you live happily ever after, and in the other case you get slapped in the face. So this seems like a cute little example, but what if we were, say, keeping track of all of our suitors in a table view? It's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. We can set up a suitors cell, UI table view cell, and refer just to, and not worry about the details of it too closely. Set the data as the delegate, and now we can refer to the endearments or to the result of the proposal without necessarily having to know if we have a upstanding gentleman in this particular cell or a scoundrel. It's a nice way of keeping everything sort of neat in its own lane. So why did I think they were like Mr. Darcy? Well, the first time I encountered a protocol and delegate, they felt a little bit like titled nobility programming business. Like, it was just so fancy pants the first time I saw this. And I felt like the code knew something I didn't, which is not the sort of thing I react to very well. Why couldn't I do this sort of thing with inheritance, or by coupling together the data with the table view cell with the data that it's going to contain? Well, because as it turns out, those things can lead to like Wickham levels of disgrace. You're going to have bad and messy code. It's going to be tightly and inappropriately coupled together, and that's just going to bring shame on you and your entire family, and you don't need it. As you read through Pride and Prejudice, at a certain point it becomes clear that Mr. Darcy is just kind of an awkward guy with resting bitch face. He wasn't being a jerk, he was just kind of uncomfortable at a fancy ball, which I think we all would be. So when I first encountered, kind of like that, when I first encountered delegates, they felt a little inscrutable. I felt like there was some wall in between what my code was doing and what I was actually looking at. But in the end, cleanly separated code that follows a defined contract is not only perfectly upstanding and respectable, but it's going to rescue you in the background quietly from all manner of disaster. So that's Mr. Darcy and protocols, and maybe also an important lesson for all of us about snap judgments and letting your own pride blind you to possibilities of something. One could say prejudice. Let's talk about what is not necessarily my favorite Swift feature, but definitely my favorite Jane Austen hero, Captain Wentworth from Persuasion. True story, I used to have a copy of Persuasion in my car, and if I was stuck in traffic, I would open to my favorite part and read it. Luckily, we have technology now, so it's bookmarked on my phone. So, Persuasion's one of those novels that starts with, like, 7 years ago, a bunch of stuff happened. Anne Elliot broke an engagement to a young naval officer, Frederick Wentworth. He was fantastic and ambitious, but he didn't have the sort of name that the Elliots had. He didn't have the lineage going back centuries, and he didn't have a fancy manner or a name, all of this stuff. So her family talked her into breaking off the engagement. Time passes, the Napoleonic Wars happen, Freddie Wentworth becomes Captain Wentworth, who has become a decorated naval officer and also made a ton of money looting French ships, and Anne kind of turns into an old spinster. And not only that, this family that was so better than Wentworth has run through all of their money and been reduced to leaving their manor and renting it out to another naval officer, who, of course, because this is a novel, is friends with Captain Wentworth. Persuasion is one of those novels where people are like running back and forth across England for all kinds of reasons. At one point, a whole party of people are in line taking a walk on a beach with like a wall on it, and one of the women falls down, and it's a lot of like women in petticoats panicking, Anne handles herself with some, general competence, and Wentworth, who had been kind of bitter about the whole getting dumped thing, starts to, warm up to her a little bit. They all go to Bath, because you have to go to Bath in an Austen novel. It's a rule. And in Bath, there is a scene in a drawing room, very small room, where Anne is having a conversation with a naval officer whose wife has died about whether or not men or women fall out of love faster. And because it's a novel, Captain Wentworth is also in his room, sitting awkwardly close to hear this whole conversation about how she's been in love with this guy for years. She's not going to mention his name, but she kind of accidentally dumped him 10 years ago. It's a whole thing. Captain Wentworth overhears all of this, writes a beautiful letter that I really want to quote at length, but I won't. And, of course, they end up married and happy at the end. Which made me think of if statements and switch statements. I'm sure made you think that as well. So let's go back to our table view of suitors, right? Let's say we want to change our tint color based on what setting we're in. And then we also want to change a text label based on our suitor's name. We could totally do it with this like stacked up if statement. It works. It's kind of complicated. Digging into it for debugging could get a little messy. And actually trying to understand what this is doing might take you about a week. And God forbid you want to add another level of complexity to this. But it works, and you're familiar with it. At least I am. And like I said, I don't have a CS degree. I don't know how it rolls in the fancy Academy of Computer Scientry. But for me, the if statement was pretty much the first bit of logic I ever wrote and ever programmed. And it's like the first time I ever directed a computer to make a decision. I knew this. I was comfortable with it. And it was a known quantity to me. And then you've got this kind of thing. A switch statement with some cases. It's a lot cleaner. It's a lot clearer in intent, and if you have to find out what's going on in here, you can scan it a lot faster. And maybe this is just my experience, but I've seen a lot more of these in the Swift code that I've been working in than I saw in any of the Objective-C projects I worked on. And it felt, when I was first diving into Swift, like one more thing that I needed to try and wrap my head around at a point when I was still randomly throwing question marks into my code to make things compile. So I kind of wanted to avoid them. I couldn't see what this was offering me that was any better than my really complicated if statement. But as it turns out, these kinds of if blocks are, this kind of thing, ends up being kind of expensive. It's spendthrift with your attention and with your own brain power, and can even get that way with your processing power if it gets too complicated. I won't bore you with my entire work history, but the new Swift project that I was working on was a food ordering app, and I was doing a lot of the UI styling, and we had a lot of table views whose structure and structure and appearance depended heavily on other things. Was it a delivery order or a pickup order? There's 5 different menus that were styling slightly differently with slightly different rules depending on what they were. And trying to keep track of all of that in this increasingly deep if statements was getting really mentally expensive. So, kind of like Captain Wentworth, this kind of construction's been around for a while. It's not particularly new to Swift. And Swift wasn't really even the first place I saw it. But where I'm at now, and with what I was working on, I can appreciate it a lot more. And pretty much, it's been a while. I'm ready to marry a switch statement. We can do that. That's cool. So we've got the thing that I kind of hated that eventually won me over, and the thing that I finally saw the value to after a while. But, we all know where my heart truly lies with Swift, right? And so let's talk about maybe my second favorite Austen hero and far and away my favorite thing in Swift. I'll give you all a moment if you need it. I made this slide a week and a half ago, and now it's... Let's talk about guard statements and Colonel Brandon from Sense and Sensibility. We're going to talk about the B plot of Sense and Sensibility. The A plot revolves around fascinating things like Regency-era inheritance law and the kinds of wacky hijinks you can get up to when you have 4 brothers all called Mr. Ferrers. So we got Marianne Dashwood, the younger sister of the Dashwood family. It's a very sort of romantic and sensitive soul. And she meets the charming Mr. Willoughby when she sprains her ankle. It's raining, she sprains her ankle walking on the moors, and this handsome stranger rides up in a horse and literally carries her away. There is not a single romance novel cliche left out of this scene. They're completely inseparable and deeply in love until the moment he kind of goes off to London and stops returning her letters. Colonel Brandon shows up. He's slightly older. He's a little bit boring. He's obviously taken with Marianne, and like the only interesting thing about him is that people keep whispering about how he might have a bastard daughter, but nobody knows for sure. Marianne ends up in London, where she hopes to meet Mr. Willoughby again. She does, unfortunately, at a dance where he's very sort of 17th century rude to her, and he sends her this letter where it's like, you're a silly little girl and I was never interested in you and whatever, and by the way, have you met my new fiance who's super wealthy and you're not? Marianne falls ill because, like I said, she's a little delicate. Not terribly ill, just interestingly so. Colonel Brandon helps care for her. He goes like riding out to bring her mother to the manor where she's recuperating and sits by her bedside reading her sonnets. And eventually in all of this we learn that the bastard daughter is actually his niece that he adopted when she was orphaned, and because it's a novel, the niece was seduced and ruined by Willoughby and they fought a duel over it, but nobody really got hurt, so it wasn't that great a duel. And of course, Colonel Brandon and Marianne get married. Another story you've heard a million times, the charming jerk breaks somebody's heart and she sees the value of the good guy next door. The mind turns naturally to guard statements in moments like this. Again, this is from the docs. Basically, a guard statement is, in a nutshell, an improvement on the sort of old, if X doesn't equal Y, do a thing construction. So let's look at some Willoughby code. This looks pretty straightforward, doesn't it? I mean, if you don't have a suitor who doesn't have a hat, or if his income is, I always have to do the thing with the alligators to remember which one's greater than and which one's less than, then you don't marry him, but if you don't have a suitor, perfect sense, right? This is confusing. This looks like it's your friend. It cuddles up to you, it makes all kinds of promises, you think it's lining up your expectations exactly as you want them to be. But when you have to debug this kind of code in a hurry because you need to get a build to a client by the end of the day, that's just when this code is going to fuck off to London and stop taking your calls. You got to be careful with this kind of thing because it's super easy to get ahead of yourself when scanning through it, misunderstand what's actually happening, make a bunch of assumptions, and end up getting your heart broken and possibly getting consumption or something. Whereas you've got Brandon code. Very straightforward. There's a little bit of, I haven't seen this before, is there really a bastard daughter? No, we're good here. Confusion, and then you realize that what you have is just something that works and is slightly poetic too. And I think there's something kind of artful and lovely about a guard statement, but it doesn't really, it's no expense at readability. In a lot of ways, I think it's a little more readable than the complicated if things. So maybe you're not seeing the connection to Colonel Brandon just yet. Hold on. When I went to go see the movie version of Sense and Sensibility with Alan Rickman that came out some years ago, the person I went to see it with hated the ending. He felt like, at the end, Marianne had settled for Colonel Brandon. Like, she wanted the dashing hero, but she couldn't have him, so she went with the boring guy. And I was like, no. That's not what happened at all. She was looking for the romantic hero. She was looking for someone who would woo her with sonnets. And she was looking for it in this, like, giant cliche of a thing. And she found it with the other guy. And it's more about not settling for something, but finding exactly what you were looking for in a completely unexpected place. And that's kind of what I love about guard statements, because they are elegant in both the scientific and artistic sense of the word, both in what they're actually doing and in how they go about doing it. I think there is something really graceful about the language. We would call it syntax, but this is like a graceful use of syntax. To two things that don't normally go together. And something that you don't expect to find. I know that programming and code can be a creative endeavor, but I don't think a lot of people expect to see actual poetry in their code. And for me, a guard statement is actual poetry. The difference between this, which gets the job done, and this, which gets the job done and is elegant, is kind of the difference between listening to a self-help guru talk for an hour about the importance of meeting people where they are and accepting people for who they are with all of their faults, and saying, love is not love which alters when an alteration finds. One of them, they both get the job done. One of them is talking about truth with a little t, and one of them is giving you that and truth with sort of a capital T. So I've got some feels about guard statements, obviously, and maybe some feels about programming Swift in general. I spend a lot of time feeling like the code that I am looking at is a garden, and I am constantly astonished by it. by the cool things that we can do with it, and the interesting ways that we can do them, and the ways that syntax can be used to express an idea. Well-written code should always tell a story just as clearly as any novel does. And hopefully, I've given you another way of thinking about your code, whether it's in Swift or not, so that you can all go off now and write code stories that are as universally truthful as Austen's have been. So, thank you for entertaining me in this ridiculous exercise. Do you have any questions?